It started with a hand, his hand pressed over her mouth in the middle of a courthouse hallway, in full uniform, under the watchful eyes of silence and surveillance. He thought he could shut her up, humiliate her, make her disappear behind procedure. But what he didn't know, she was a decorated lieutenant, and that slap she delivered wasn't rage, it was justice. What followed was bigger than him, bigger than her. It shook an entire department and sparked a movement that refused to be silenced. This is a story of dignity, power, and the cost of staying quiet too long. Drop a comment below, let us know what time you're listening and where you're tuning in from. We're about to dive deep, and trust me, you'll feel this one. The marble floors of the courthouse held onto the cold like a secret, polished to a shine that distorted every reflection but revealed nothing. Afternoon sunlight spilled through the high windows in golden angles, slicing across the hallway, like measured judgment, illuminating dust that drifted slowly in the air as if reluctant to settle. The building was quiet in the way places of power always are, hushed but never asleep, watching with invisible eyes behind walls lined with framed portraits of men who wore robes like armor and smiles like warning signs. Lieutenant Ava Durant walked through that silence with steady steps, and a posture sculpted by years of earning every inch of space she took up. Her uniform was crisp, not out of vanity but ritual-pressed blues, polished badge, the belt worn just enough to know she worked. Her left hand cradled a leather binder against her ribs. Her right hand stayed loose, close to her sidearm but not drawn. Every hallway in this building had a memory for her, and most of them weren't kind. She didn't glance at the portraits. They never looked like her. The security checkpoint was up ahead, manned by a young officer who looked barely old enough to rent a car. He noticed Ava approaching and straightened reflexively, hand flying to his belt, nodding with a stiffness that betrayed his nerves. Ava gave him a small nod, not unkind, and stepped through the scanner with a practiced ease, her mind already on the audit schedule. She was here for something simple, just an observation review on courthouse security protocols for the precinct. No drama. No confrontation, in and out by 5 if the world behaved. But even as she told herself that, Ava felt the weight pressing between her shoulders, the kind of pressure that doesn't come from the task but from knowing the space isn't built for you. You're not here to ruffle feathers, she reminded herself, her voice low in her chest, barely a whisper of breath. Just do the job. No sudden moves, no heat. It was the mantra of every black officer she'd trained, mentored, or outlasted. As she rounded the corner toward the South Annex, the sound of a muffled laugh echoed down the tiled corridor, sharp, male, arrogant. She didn't flinch, but her breath caught just a moment. The courthouse was supposed to be a place of order, but some corners bent the rules to fit the people who worked them. Ava had learned the hard way that a badge on your chest didn't shield you from the eyes that still saw you as other. She passed by courtroom 6A, where the double doors were cracked open, allowing voices to drift out, some lawyer arguing points, the judge's voice low and unimpressed. The hallway smelled faintly of old paper, pine cleaner, and reheated coffee. Every few feet a bench ran along the wall, usually empty. Today, a young Latina woman sat there, nervously scrolling her phone, wearing a faded gray hoodie and jeans, her knee bouncing with tension. She looked up briefly, met Ava's eyes, then looked away. Ava nodded once and kept walking. In the moment of that glance, something passed between them. Not fear, not respect exactly, but recognition. The kind that says, I see you. I know this place is not made for us. Keep going. Ava's boots clicked softly against the marble, a quiet metronome to her thoughts. She reviewed her mental checklist, scanner calibration, logs, staff rotation, blind spot coverage. But her focus kept pulling towards something heavier. She could feel the air shifting. Something wasn't right. It was too quiet near the South Annex too, still for mid-afternoon. She slowed her pace slightly, her eyes narrowing. As she stepped into the annex hallway, a janitor's cart was parked near the vending machines. The hum of the soda machine mixed with the far-off clatter of footsteps upstairs, but there was no chatter, no clerks, no deputies. Just that stillness again. Then came a voice, deep, flat, annoyed. That's not how we do things down here. Who said you could authorize that reroute? Ava stopped. The voice was unmistakable. Rick Talley. She exhaled slowly, like someone walking out into cold air after a funeral. She hadn't seen him in almost a year, but the tone hadn't changed. He was the kind of man who believed he carried justice in his holster and truth in his volume. the kind who'd served too long to be corrected and too proud to care if he was wrong. His reprimands weren't for correction, they were for performance. And now from the sound of it, he was already mid-performance. Ava walked forward calm on the surface, but her pulse tapped faster against her collar. The hallway curved ahead, voices clearer now. She rounded the bend and saw him, broad-shouldered, graying lips curled into a smirk as he loomed over a younger officer. His tone wasn't just aggressive, it was dismissive, and loud enough to be intentional. The younger officer looked like he wanted to disappear into the wall. Ava could see it in the boy's clenched jaw, the way he shifted his weight, half ready to leave, half afraid to move. Ava's voice was calm but firm. "Everything all right here, Officer Tally?" He turned slowly, like someone being interrupted from a meal. His eyes ran up her uniform like a scanner, landing on her face with a flicker of something recognition, then disdain. "Didn't realize this hallway was under new management," he said, too casually. "Or are you just doing a little walk-through, Lieutenant?" There it was. The tone, the weight on the rank, the suggestion she didn't belong unless she was just passing through. Ava didn't blink. "I'm reviewing court security coverage. Carry on." She kept her tone even neutral, not backing down, not rising to the bait. But inside, something had already shifted. The air in the hallway felt heavier now. And something told her this was no longer going to be a quiet day. Officer Rick Tally had been pacing the courthouse annex since noon, chewing on the inside of his cheek like a man waiting for trouble he could shape with his own hands. His boots hit the floor too hard, too slow, echoing off the marble with the smug rhythm of someone who believed the building owed him respect. He leaned against a bulletin board covered in outdated notices and bent posters, arms folded across a vest, stretched tight over his chest, eyes scanning everyone who passed with that same sour mix of suspicion and entitlement. He'd been at this precinct for over 25 years and wore his seniority like a weapon, one that didn't need to be drawn to leave bruises. To some, Tally was just another old-school cop who didn't take crap and liked things done by the book. His book, mostly unwritten, rarely followed, but always enforced when it suited him. To others, especially the newer recruits, and anyone who didn't match his view of what authority should look like, he was something more dangerous, a man who confused control with integrity and who treated policy like a suggestion if it came from the wrong voice or the wrong skin. He never shouted without intention, never picked his targets blindly. He had a type, young, uncertain, often black or brown, usually quiet, and he pressed on them until they either broke or learned to stay out of his way. That afternoon, his gaze fell on Officer Dean, the rookie from the checkpoint, who had apparently moved a sign-in station without asking for permission, not from anyone who actually required it, but from Tally, who declared himself guardian of that hallway like it was sacred ground. "Who gave you the authority to move anything?" Tally barked, his voice low but sharp enough to slice through the quiet like a razor. Dean hesitated, clearly flustered, holding a clipboard like it could shield him. "Lieutenant Durant requested the adjustment for better foot traffic flow, sir," he said, eyes flicking downward. Tally snorted, stepped in closer, close enough that Dean had to take a half step back. "Lieutenant Durant, well, ain't that convenient," he muttered, drawing out the title like it left a bad taste in his mouth. His voice took on that familiar, oily tone he used when he wanted to be overheard. Another desk boss trying to make changes just to prove she's got brass on her collar. From around the corner, Ava had already begun walking in their direction, having heard enough of the exchange to know where it was going. Her heels tapped softly as she approached her steps, measured shoulders squared, not out of confrontation, but control. She didn't want a scene. But Tally thrived on the theater of disrespect. He wanted the hallway to be his stage and Dean to be his prop. When Ava stepped into view, Tally didn't falter, he smiled. That kind of slow, mean grin that said he'd already decided how this story ended. Well, he said, his tone falsely bright. "Lieutenant Durant, I didn't know we were micromanaging hallway furniture now." Ava didn't return the smile. Her expression was calm, unreadable, like a mask carved from stone. She walked up beside Dean, glanced briefly at the clipboard, then met Tally's eyes with the steady gaze of someone who'd stopped needing to raise her voice to be heard. "Officer Dean is following my directive," she said simply. "If you have a concern, you're free to file it formally. But you don't speak to my officers like that." Tally tilted his head, his amusement deepening. "Your officers," he repeated, as if testing the phrase. "That's cute. Didn't know we started handing out command to just anybody." His words weren't just disrespectful, they were chosen with precision, designed to undermine, to call her presence a mistake, her authority a gimmick, her position unearned. Ava didn't react, not visibly, but inside her pulse knocked twice against her ribs. This wasn't new, it wasn't surprising. But it was tiring in a way she hadn't yet found words, for like being forced to carry a weight, no one else could see one that grew heavier every time she had to pretend it wasn't there. She knew the hallway had ears, and she knew Tally was counting on that. This wasn't about a sign-in sheet, it was about reminding the room who he believed still held the floor. She turned slightly toward Dean. "Go ahead and finalize that change," she said, voice low but steady. "You're doing fine." Dean hesitated for a split second, then nodded, and walked off, the tension in his shoulders slowly unwinding. Tally watched him go, eyes narrowed, then turned back to Ava, his voice lowering. "You really think anyone around here sees you as one of us?" he asked, quiet enough now that no one else could hear. "You're a placeholder, Durant. A headline." Ava stared at him for a long moment, not because she was shocked she wasn't, but because she understood the choice she faced. Let it go, and he'd only grow bolder. Respond too hard, and the institution would shift its weight to protect him. She picked neither. "You don't speak for us, Rick," she said evenly. "And you never did." His mouth twitched, the smirk faltering just enough to reveal the crack beneath it. Ava stepped past him without another word, her spine straight, her face calm, but her jaw set just a little tighter than before. She didn't need to win this hallway. She needed to outlast it. And as she walked on, the air behind her felt colder than before. There's a particular kind of silence that falls in buildings meant for justice, not the sacred hush of reverence, but the heavy, waiting kind, as though the walls themselves are bracing for what's about to happen. That's the silence that settled over the courthouse hallway when Rick Tally raised his voice again, this time louder, sharper, designed to pierce the air and leave a mark. It wasn't just about Officer Dean anymore. It was about who was watching and who was expected to look away. The hum of vending machines and the soft clack of distant office keyboards seemed to vanish into the background as Tally took a slow, deliberate step toward Ava. The floor beneath him didn't creak, but somehow the sound of his boots still carried dense and echoing, as if the building itself was registering each movement with reluctance. Ava didn't move. She stood still, spine straight, arms relaxed, but ready, the binder still tucked neatly under her left arm, as if refusing to give him the satisfaction of even one flinch. "You know what I think, Lieutenant Tally," said his voice oily with false civility, loud enough for everyone in earshot. "I think you like the power a little too much. Been here, 5 minutes, and already acting like you own the damn place." Ava let the words wash over her, not because they didn't sting, but because she'd heard them in different forms 1,000 times before, sometimes whispered, sometimes shouted, but always meant to chip away at her authority like termites from beneath the floorboards. The hallway, once busy with quiet motion, had slowed to a crawl. A clerk paused beside a copier down the hall, pretending to organize paper. A court officer leaned against the doorframe of courtroom 6A, eyes fixed on the scene but face carefully neutral. Nobody intervened. Nobody turned away. "That's enough," Ava said calmly, voice low but firm, her gaze meeting his without blinking. "If you have a grievance, take it up through the chain of command. This ends here." But it didn't. It never does not when a man like Tally sees an audience and believes it's his to control. He stepped forward again, closer than protocol, loud enough that Ava could feel the heat of his breath tainted with stale coffee and old anger. His hand came up, not fast, not aggressive, not yet, but with the deliberate pace of someone trying to prove a point in front of an invisible jury. And then, without warning, he pressed it against her face. His palm landed over her mouth, fingers spread, not in violence, not in force, but in violation, quiet, calculated, complete. The hallway held its breath. The movement was so unexpected, so absurd in its confidence, that even the air seemed to stop. Ava's eyes widened, not from fear but from disbelief, because in all her years of training, of commanding, of withstanding men like this, she had never once imagined one would dare to silence her with his hand. Not here. not in public, not with a badge on his chest. "Shut that mouth," Tally growled, voice barely audible now, thick with contempt. "I'm not finished." Ava stood frozen for a heartbeat, her body registering the contact like an open wound that hadn't yet bled. Every instinct screamed for reaction, defensive, professional, tactical, but something deeper, older, louder told her to wait. Let it land. Let it be seen. Around her, the hallway felt miles long. Somewhere down the corridor, a printer beeped once and fell silent. A soft gasp came from the young clerk behind the desk near the elevators. The security camera above the annex door blinked red, its lens tilted perfectly toward them. Tally's fingers were still on her skin, rough, heavy, smug. And then slowly Ava reached up and removed his hand. She didn't slap him. Not yet. She didn't shout or curse or even raise her voice. She simply looked at him, eyes steady, jaw clenched, and said, "Don't you ever touch me again." The words came out even and quiet, but they hit the air like thunder in a chapel. Tally froze, expression flickering, first confusion, then amusement, then something darker, more unsure. He opened his mouth to speak again, maybe to double down, maybe to twist the moment into something survivable. But by then the damage was done. The weight of what just happened had settled across every witness like dust, coating everything in the undeniable truth that what they saw could not be unseen. In that frozen space between 1 second and the next, the balance of the moment shifted. Tally might have thought he was the one making a statement, the one commanding attention, but what he'd done instead was give Ava the room, and she knew exactly how to use it. She inhaled once slowly and straightened, even though she had never slouched. Her voice didn't tremble, her gaze didn't waver. "You think yelling makes you right, Rick," she said quietly. "You think silence means obedience. But you're wrong. All you've done is remind every person here what happens when men like you think they can't be held accountable." He stepped back just slightly, but the shift was unmistakable. His hands dropped to his sides, his smirk dissolved, and the hallway, still holding its breath, finally began to murmur. Not loudly, not yet, but enough. The bailiff near the stairwell pulled out his phone. The clerk by the copier whispered something to a colleague, eyes wide. A paralegal exiting a courtroom stopped mid-step, sensing that the story she was walking into might just rewrite something larger than policy. Ava didn't need to tell them what happened. They'd seen it, and more importantly, they believed it. As she turned and walked away, the sound of her heels clicking against the marble was no longer quiet. It echoed. It stayed. For one long, suspended moment, Ava stood there with the lingering heat of his hand, still clinging to her skin as if it had branded something deeper than the flesh. The lights above her buzzed faintly in the silence, flickering just enough to feel colder than they should have, casting long shadows along the polished floor that stretched like ghosts behind her. Every inch of her body was aware of the cameras mounted in the corners, of the slight shuffle of a witness trying not to be seen, of the weight of every eye in that hallway. Suddenly pointed her way, unsure what to do with the truth they just watched unfold in real time. She exhaled slowly, not out of relief but restraint, because her body had started to remember things it had spent decades trying to forget. There had been a day like this before, years ago, long before the badge, before the rank, before she even had the language to name what she was fighting. She had been 16, standing next to her mother in the center of a downtown square during a protest that was supposed to be peaceful until it wasn't. Her mother had been holding a handmade sign paint, still streaked from the drying sun, and she'd said, "They're going to look at you and think your voice is too loud before you even open your mouth." That afternoon, an officer, white, heavy-set, sweating through his uniform, had pressed his hand over her mother's lips as she tried to speak. Not scream, not provoke, just speak. And Ava remembered the look in her mother's eyes. In that moment, not fear, not even humiliation, but a quiet kind of fury that didn't burn, didn't boil, but calcified, hardened, stayed. Now, decades later, standing in this courthouse hallway, dressed in the very uniform that once marked her mother as a threat, Ava felt the echo of that day press itself into her spine. It wasn't just Tally's hand. She was feeling it was his arrogance, his certainty that no one would stop him, his belief that her voice didn't belong in this place unless it agreed with his version of order. But it wasn't only about him. It never was. Men like Tally didn't invent the silence, they just inherited the permission to enforce it. Her hands, which had remained steady through interrogations, night raids, and more traffic stops than she could count, now trembled slightly at her sides, not from fear but from the cold pressure of control, slipping momentarily from her grasp. She adjusted her stance by a half-inch, squared her shoulders again, and breathed in through her nose. The air tasted stale, metallic like old radiator steam and courthouse dust, but it grounded her. Behind her, a cough, the soft drag of a shoe. The world was beginning to move again, but she wasn't ready to let it go. Not yet. She turned her head slightly enough to catch Tally still standing a few feet away, arms now crossed, jaw tight, but eyes flicking toward the camera, calculating. He was beginning to realize he had gone too far, but not because he was sorry, because he was visible. Ava's voice, when it came again, wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. "Do you know what it means to put your hand over someone's mouth?" she said, not looking directly at him now, but past him, as if addressing something larger. "It's not just disrespect. It's control. It's silencing someone you think shouldn't speak." Tally shifted, uncomfortable now, but she didn't give him time to respond. "When I was a girl," she continued, "I watched a man do that to my mother. I swore I'd never let it happen again. To her, to me, to anyone who didn't have the badge or the skin you think gives you the right." Her words weren't for him. They were for the hallway, for the cameras, for the witnesses too afraid to speak, for the clerk, still pretending to staple something she hadn't printed. They were for the memory of her mother, for the trembling hands that had held protest signs when Ava still wore sneakers with holes in the toes. She spoke for all the voices pressed down in places like this, in rooms like these, by men who thought silence was compliance. Tally muttered something under his breath, maybe an insult, maybe a defense, but Ava didn't flinch this time. She stepped forward, not to threaten but to reclaim the space that had always been hers. "You don't get to decide who's allowed to lead here, Rick," she said. "You lost that right the moment you put your hand where it never should have been." Then, with her chin lifted and her breath now steady, she turned, not as a retreat but as a deliberate withdrawal. She had nothing to prove in this hallway anymore. The proof had already been laid bare in the stillness, in the shock, in the silence that had followed his touch. Let him stay standing there with all his years of power and none of its dignity. As Ava walked away, the sound of her footsteps no longer felt like retreat. They rang with memory, with purpose, with a slow-burning resolve that could no longer be silenced. And somewhere deep in the quiet, the echo of her mother's voice whispered, "Don't you ever lower your eyes, girl, not for them, never again. There's a point, quiet, sharp, and final, when a line isn't just crossed, it's burned away entirely." Ava felt that moment settle deep in her bones as she stood in that hallway surrounded by silence so thick it clung to the skin like damp fabric. Her breath was steady now, but not calm. It carried the kind of weight that comes from holding back for too long, from absorbing too many offenses while pretending they were just part of the job. Every inch of her body knew that what just happened had changed something, not just in her, but in the space between her and every witness still pretending not to watch. Rick Tally stood there, posture loose but jaw tight, trying to read the room like a man who'd lost control of the story. He'd miscalculated not the slap yet, but the depth of her silence. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't lashed out. And somehow that unsettled him more than 1,000 angry words ever could. It forced him to feel his own volume, his own hand, his own place in this moment where suddenly he wasn't the one defining the rules anymore. Ava took a step forward. Not much, just enough to claim the space he'd filled with smugness and heat, and that smirk he thought could silence people like her. Her hands were at her sides, open still. Her voice, when she finally spoke, came out low, measured, shaped by years of choosing her words carefully enough to stay employed, yet strong enough to remain herself. "You want to make me small," she said, her eyes never leaving his, "but I was never built to shrink for you." Tally opened his mouth, perhaps to respond, perhaps to sneer, but he didn't get the chance. Ava raised her hand and slapped him. The sound cracked through the hallway like a gavel dropped hard onto oak, sharp and final. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't angry. It was something older, deeper, something ceremonial. It was the kind of slap that didn't ask for justice, but delivered a piece of it raw and unfiltered into the moment where it was owed. Tally staggered back half a step, not from the force, but from the shock, like a man suddenly waking up to realize the rules of the room had changed and no one had told him. His hand moved instinctively to his face, brushing the skin where her palm had landed, his eyes wide with disbelief and bruised pride. No one spoke, no one moved. Even the distant printers, once humming down the corridor, seemed to fall silent, as though the building itself understood the gravity of what had just happened. A junior officer near the stairwell blinked slowly, his mouth slightly open. The court clerk, who had been stacking files, paused mid-motion, a single sheet slipping from her hand and fluttering to the floor like the breath everyone had forgotten to take. Ava didn't flinch. She didn't retreat. She simply stood there, breathing quietly, eyes steady, heart calm, in a way she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't because she wanted to do it. It wasn't because it solved anything. But because in that moment, with his hand still remembered on her face and his words still echoing in her chest, she knew something had to push back. Not just for her, but for every officer who'd swallowed disrespect in silence, for every woman who'd been dismissed in plain view, for every moment justice had stood just one gesture too far away. Tally finally spoke, his voice brittle and uncertain. "You just assaulted an officer." Ava's voice was even. "Number, I defended my dignity." He blinked, uncertain now, the bravado beginning to fracture his eyes, darting toward the camera in the hallway corner, the red light blinking with quiet consistency, recording everything, sealing it into memory with perfect digital recall. For the first time he looked small. Not because of the slap, but because she hadn't been afraid of the cost. Down the corridor movement resumed. It was subtle at first, a door opening, a phone ringing, the shuffling of someone walking a little faster than before. But the atmosphere had changed. It wasn't just about Ava and Tally anymore. It had become something else, something alive. The kind of moment people would whisper about in break rooms and retell in lowered voices, not because they didn't understand it, but because they did. Ava turned to walk away, not quickly, not triumphantly, but with the same calm she'd carried into the building earlier that day. Her binder still under one arm, her uniform still neat, her silence now filled with meaning that no file or report could contain. She didn't look back. Behind her, Tally stood frozen, his authority cracked, his story interrupted. And for the first time in a long while, the hallway belonged to someone else. For a long second after the slap, nobody moved, as if time had thickened and the hallway had forgotten how to breathe. You could feel it in the stillness, in the way the sound hung in the air like a thunderclap refusing to fade. There was no chaos, no shouting, no reaction, not yet. Just the reverberation of something sacred being broken and something necessary taking its place. The tension didn't explode outward like a fire, it imploded quietly, folding into the bones of every person who'd just witnessed something they weren't sure they were allowed to believe. Ava could feel it, the weight of their eyes, the hush behind the glances, the bracing silence of a space waiting to choose a side. She didn't move right away. She held her ground for a few seconds longer, not out of defiance but out of understanding. What had just happened wasn't over. It was still unfolding second by second in the minds of every witness, scrambling to decide what story they'd tell themselves later. The young clerk by the copier, a Latina woman in her late 20s, blinked slowly as though waking from a dream. Her hands hovered over a stack of papers she no longer remembered holding. She caught Ava's eye for a brief, breathless instant, just long enough to communicate something silent, something unspoken. It wasn't pity, it wasn't fear, it was acknowledgement. A shared knowledge of what it meant to be spoken over, touched without consent, made to feel small in places designed to make others feel powerful. Across the hallway, a deputy stood just inside the glass doors of courtroom 6A, his hand frozen mid-reach for the handle. He looked young, maybe early 30s, white, clean-cut, the kind of man who usually said nothing and went home pretending he hadn't noticed. But today he wasn't looking away. He wasn't stepping in either, but there was something in the way he lingered that felt different, unsure, maybe, or finally unsure enough to pay attention. And then came the shuffle of fabric. The bailiff by the stairwell moved first, not dramatically, just enough to shift his weight and slide a phone from his pocket. He didn't lift it high, he didn't zoom or announce, but he recorded quietly like a man who'd seen too many things disappear under the weight of silence and wanted proof this time that the world had seen it too. Tally, for his part, stood rigid, his face burning red beneath the pale sheen of overhead lights. His mouth opened once, then closed again. as if the right words were just out of reach, or worse, as if he was finally realizing there were no right words left to cover what he'd done. His chest rose and fell too quickly, his hand still hanging in the air like he didn't know what to do with it. He turned slightly, glanced at the camera near the elevator, then back at the faces in the hallway, all of which now bore the same expression, one part curiosity, one part disbelief, and one part quiet judgment. You all saw that he finally muttered, his voice cracking. "She laid her hands on me." No one answered. Not a single voice rose to support him. Not even the usual nods from men who always seemed eager to agree when something uncomfortable passed as discipline. What echoed back to him wasn't resistance, it was absence. An absence of backing, an absence of faith. The kind of void that made a man question whether he had misread not just the room but the whole world. Ava turned then slowly, deliberately, her gaze sweeping over the faces frozen in place like figures in a paused film. She wasn't angry, not visibly, but there was something in her eyes that dared someone to reduce what they had seen to a moment of misconduct. It wasn't about rage, it wasn't about retaliation, it was about finally letting the silence speak for itself, and letting everyone else decide whether they were brave enough to listen. She locked eyes with the bailiff, whose phone was now lowered but still in hand. "You recording that for evidence or just to gossip later?" she asked, her tone measured but edged with steel. The man shifted awkwardly but didn't look away. "Ma'am," he said quiet, "I figured somebody had to make sure the story doesn't change." For the first time since the slap, Ava nodded, not as approval, not as thanks, but as recognition. She could feel the hallway starting to breathe again, people shifting slightly, footsteps starting to resume, but everything had changed. It was no longer just about her and Tally. The story had become communal, claimed by the collective gaze of those who'd stood frozen in its unfolding. Someone at the end of the hall whispered, "She's a lieutenant," and the words moved like a ripple down the corridor. A man in plain clothes stepped out of a courtroom, eyes darting between faces, trying to understand what had just happened. And over by the security desk, a uniformed officer leaned in close to his partner and said under his breath, "She didn't just slap him, she put the whole damn system on notice." Tally tried again, louder this time. "This is assault. I'm filing charges." Ava didn't turn. "You go ahead," she said, steady as stone. "But make sure you tell them everything. Tell them why." The elevator chimed softly behind her as the doors opened and someone stepped out just as the hallway began to move again, not with chaos but with purpose. Papers shuffled, doors opened, the machinery of the courthouse resumed, but nothing was quite the same. And as Ava walked slowly toward the opposite end, her steps calm and deliberate, she knew she had not started this moment, but she had claimed it. And now the silence that once protected men like Tally no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the witnesses. It belonged to the recording. It belonged to truth. Ava didn't go straight home after the incident, though every muscle in her body begged her to disappear somewhere quiet. Instead, she sat in her car 2 blocks away from the courthouse windows, rolled up engine off the binder, still resting on her lap like an anchor. Her hands were folded over it, calm on the surface, but beneath her skin she felt every tremor, every ripple of adrenaline still trying to make sense of what had just happened. She didn't replay the slap itself, she replayed the silence that came after it, the way the hallway breathed with her, not against her for the first time in what felt like years. She wasn't proud in the way people often use the word. There was no triumph in her chest, no victory in her breath. What she felt instead was something slower, quieter, but far more enduring clarity. The kind that arrives after a long storm when the sky is still heavy but the horizon is visible again. Her father once told her that clarity doesn't come when you're ready, it comes when you're cornered and have no more illusions left to protect. Back at home that evening, she sat at her kitchen table with a half cup of tea. She never touched, watching the light shift across the hardwood floor, like it was trying to tell her something. Her phone buzzed every few minutes, texts from colleagues, missed calls from unknown numbers, an alert from the precinct's internal portal, letting her know that an official inquiry had been opened. She stared at the screen for a moment, then turned it face down. The ritual of self-preservation didn't require her to read every word right now. She already knew what they would say. The department wouldn't care about what led up to it, they never did. They'd want to know why she hadn't walked away, why she hadn't filed a report, why she let her hands speak when her badge was supposed to be the only voice she needed. They would weigh everything: her tone, her stance, her expression, and dissect it like a crime scene, not because they needed justice, but because they needed order. And order, Ava knew, often came at the expense of truth. Her mind drifted back to the academy, the early days when she was still learning how to stand still, while men tested the edge of her silence. There had been a drill sergeant named Booker, a man with gravel in his voice and steel in his spine, who once pulled her aside after a training session and said, "You're gonna get tested differently, Durant. They won't come at you head-on. They'll chip you, quietly, every damn day. Know when to let it pass, and know when to stop the knife." At the time, she hadn't fully understood what he meant. Now she did. She opened her laptop later that night and began typing a personal account of the incident. Not for the report, not yet, but for herself. A first draft of memory, raw and untouched, written in the language of fatigue and resistance. The words came slower than usual, her fingers pausing between lines as if her body needed time to grant permission for the truth to emerge. She wrote about the hallway, about Tally's eyes, about the touch that was too deliberate to be accidental. She described the moment after the slap, not to justify it, but to preserve it before others had the chance to reshape it. A few paragraphs in, she paused and stared at the sentence that lingered on the screen. "I did what I had to do because there was no one else left to do it." Her throat tightened not with tears, but with the simple weight of recognition. Later, she dug through the top drawer of her desk and pulled out a photo she hadn't looked at in months. Her and her mother standing shoulder to shoulder at a community event, arms crossed the same way, the same quiet fire in their faces. Her mother had always told her, being right doesn't mean being safe, but sometimes you've got to pick one and live with it. That night, Ava didn't sleep much. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that amplifies the heartbeat and sharpens the memory. She got up once around 3, walked barefoot to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and stared out the window at the neighborhood bathed in amber streetlight. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once and went quiet. Somewhere even closer, her reflection stared back at her in the glass, tired still but unbroken. When morning came, Ava ironed her uniform, as she always did. Precise creases, clean lines, the badge wiped and centered. It wasn't about perfection. It was about discipline. It was about saying without words, "I'm still here." She packed her things, opened her front door, and stepped into the light with a gait that hadn't changed but now carried something more. She was no longer just returning to work. She was returning as someone who had drawn a line, not just for herself, but for everyone who'd been waiting for someone else to go first. And the silence she once walked through would never feel the same again. The message came through an official department email at 8:16 the next morning. Subject line: bold, curt, impersonal notification of administrative review, Lieutenant Ava Durant. No greeting, no explanation, just a timestamp and instructions to report to Internal Affairs by noon for an initial interview. She sat at her desk in the precinct's operations office, the same office she had earned with years of flawless conduct, looking at the screen with a stillness that wasn't surprise, but confirmation. She'd known it was coming. It always came. The system didn't hesitate to investigate an officer who pushed back, especially when the person she pushed was one of its own. Outside her window, the wind tugged at the trees in slow, uncertain waves, bending the branches but never quite breaking them. A coffee mug, half full and cooling by the minute, sat untouched by her right hand. It was a gift from her first partner years ago, black ceramic chipped along the rim with the words, "Earned, not issued," printed in worn gold. That phrase echoed now, almost mocking in the way reality liked to loop back on itself. When she finally stood straightening her jacket and reaching for her badge, the entire office seemed to hold its breath. Conversations slowed. Chairs stopped creaking. No one said anything, but their eyes followed her, not with judgment, not quite with solidarity either, but with the vague discomfort of people watching someone walk into a room they prayed they'd never be summoned to. She didn't blame them. The walls in this building were lined with stories like hers that never made it to the bulletin board, that got swept under policy reviews and paper trails until they disappeared completely. She arrived at Internal Affairs 15 minutes early. The waiting area was cold and impersonal, the chairs too firm, the lights too bright. A secretary with a tight bun and a tighter expression handed her a clipboard without making eye contact. Initial statement, she said, barely audible. "You can write or wait to speak it. They prefer the latter." Ava nodded once, took the clipboard and didn't bother filling anything in. There would be time for that later when someone asked the questions they were really hoping she wouldn't answer. The interview room was smaller than she expected. One table, 2 chairs, a mounted camera in the corner, blinking silently, red and expectant. Across from her sat Captain Heller, a tall, gaunt man with sleeves rolled too high and a smile too thin. He didn't introduce himself. He just opened a file, adjusted his glasses and said, "Let's talk about what happened in the South Annex." She folded her hands on the table. "Are we talking about what happened, or what it looked like on paper?" He looked up at her briefly, as if surprised by her composure. "What happened?" he said flatly. "In your own words." So she told him. She kept her voice steady, gave details where it mattered, avoided embellishment. She didn't dramatize, didn't defend, didn't apologize. She described the hallway, Tally's words, his proximity, the hand, the silence. She described her choice, her restraint, and the slap, not as an outburst but as an answer. Throughout it all, Heller said nothing, just wrote notes. Occasionally glanced at the camera. When she finished, he tapped his pen twice and leaned back slightly, as if bracing for a storm that hadn't yet arrived. "There's a process we have to follow," he said after a moment. "You understand that, don't you?" "I understand systems," she replied. "I also understand when they protect the wrong people. That hung in the air between them, neither hostile nor passive. Just honest." He closed the folder, folded his hands together and gave a faint nod. "You'll be on administrative leave pending review. Standard protocol." She expected that too. What she didn't expect, what twisted slightly in her gut, was how routine it all felt. Like the slap hadn't been the rupture, but the paperwork. Like the breach wasn't in Tally's hand, but in her refusal to absorb it quietly. That more than anything reminded her where she stood, not just within the department, but within the structure that pretended neutrality while flinching from truth. When she walked out of the room, no one met her eyes. Not the receptionist, not the officer walking in as she left, not even the janitor buffing the floors with a machine that squealed too loud for the silence she carried with her. She passed through the front doors without pausing, without adjusting her collar, without checking her reflection in the glass. She already knew who she was. The question now was who they would pretend to be. Back home, she sat in her living room, surrounded by quiet that didn't comfort, only measured her thoughts like a clock, counting each breath. The phone rang 3 times that afternoon, 2 reporters, 1 legal advisor. She answered none. She wasn't ready to be a symbol yet. Right now, she was just a woman in a pressed uniform who had chosen to speak in the only language that still worked. And as the sun began to lower beyond the buildings across the street, she stood by the window and watched her own shadow stretch along the floor, long, steady, untangled. For once, she didn't feel like she had to shrink inside it. The first protester showed up 3 days after the video went live, standing alone on the courthouse steps in the chill of early morning, holding a handmade sign with block letters that read, "Silence is compliance." No chant, no microphone, just one voice in a still space made louder by its restraint. By noon there were 7 more, some in hoodies, some in dress shirts, some young, some gray-haired, clustered in quiet defiance, not blocking the doors, just being seen. Someone brought a thermos of coffee. Someone else passed around flyers with a single quote from Ava Durant printed across the top. "You don't get to decide who's allowed to lead." Ava watched from a distance that day, seated in an unmarked sedan down the block, her coat collar turned up against the wind, hands still and folded in her lap. She didn't wave, she didn't speak, she just watched the slow swell of people gathering in a place that had once swallowed her voice. Now it seemed the silence was echoing with something different. She wasn't the kind of person who believed in social media movements. Hashtags could trend and vanish before the ink dried on a complaint form. But the footage of her slap-clean, unfiltered, and framed by institutional blandness had struck a nerve far beyond what she expected. It had been uploaded by a court clerk anonymously, then reposted by a civil rights group, then dissected in articles and roundtables and comment threads that ranged from furious to reverent. Some called her impulsive. Some called her heroic. Most just said, she finally did what someone should have done years ago. By the 5th day, the crowd doubled, and the signs began to change. They weren't just about Ava now, they were about policy, about dignity, about the accumulated weight of silent mistreatment inside uniformed spaces. One woman held a framed photograph of her daughter, a rookie officer who'd resigned after a year of constant undermining. A retired black detective spoke to a local news crew about the time he was denied a promotion by the same man Ava had slapped. None of it was coordinated. All of it was personal, and through it all, Ava remained still, not out of fear, but out of discipline. She knew what happened when emotion outpaced strategy. She knew the department was watching, compiling, preparing statements that made the institution seem thoughtful, neutral, invested in restoring confidence. They hadn't fired Tally, not yet. He'd been placed on paid leave, pending further review, a phrase so sterile it practically erased the harm it was meant to address. But the people weren't waiting. The movement had taken on a rhythm of its own, morning chants, silent vigils, veterans standing shoulder to shoulder, with teenagers holding signs like shields. Church elders brought folding chairs and hymn books. Local musicians played under courthouse arches. And always in the center of it all, someone carried Ava's words, not like a slogan but like a thread that tied them all to the same quiet fire. One afternoon, as she stood at her kitchen window with a cup of tea gone cold in her hand, her neighbor knocked on the back door. He was an older man, Vietnam vet, rarely spoke more than a few words unless it was about lawn care or weather. But that day he stood in the doorway with a paper in his hand folded twice, held carefully like it might fall apart. "I saw what they did to you," he said softly, not stepping inside. "And I saw how you stood there and didn't back down. Just wanted you to know you ain't alone." She nodded, grateful, in a way that couldn't quite reach her voice. After he left, she unfolded the paper. It was a photo, grainy black and white, dated 1969. A younger version of her neighbor standing at the edge of a protest line, arms linked with two other men, one of them holding a sign that said, "Dignity has no rank." She kept that photo on her fridge. And every time she passed it, she remembered what she was really fighting for, something older than any one moment, deeper than any one slap. Because this wasn't about her anymore. Not just. It was about the pressure that builds when silence is mistaken for peace, and the noise that follows when someone finally refuses to stay quiet. It was about what happened when dignity stopped whispering and started to speak in full voice, in full view, without apology. And most of all, it was about what happened when people listened and chose not to turn away. The room where Ava sat was colder than it needed to be, lit with that flat overhead fluorescence that made every surface look sterile, even the polished oak of the long conference table. The blinds were drawn tight, filtering the outside light into stripes that slashed across the floor like quiet warnings. Everything about the space felt intentional, designed not to comfort but to contain. It was the kind of room built to remind you that no matter what you'd done, you were now on the other side of the line. She was seated at the far end of the table, hands folded loosely in front of her, posture upright but not rigid. Across from her sat 5 people, 3 men, 2 women, all in various shades of navy, charcoal, and authority. They didn't introduce themselves again. She already knew who they were. Internal Review Board, specially convened for high-visibility misconduct cases, what they called a corrective mechanism. What she knew was often just a more polite name for judgment. One of the women, short hair, sharp eyes, started first. "Lieutenant Durant, thank you for being here. This isn't an interrogation. It's a review of conduct." Ava nodded once. "I understand." The woman offered a professional half-smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. "We've all seen the footage. What we're interested in is context." Ava held her gaze. "So am I." There was a brief pause, a rustle of papers, the sound of a pen cap clicking open. One of the men, balding voice slow and practiced, leaned forward. "Walk us through your decision, Lieutenant. Why respond physically? Why not disengage?" She could feel it then, the subtle shift of the room, not aggressive but pressing. The language wasn't hostile, but it was strategic, measured, framed in a way that placed the burden of explanation on her restraint, not on the offense that required it. She waited a breath before answering. "Because there's a point where words stop working," she said, voice low but clear, "and silence starts to feel like permission." Another man adjusted his tie, avoiding eye contact. The older woman seated at the center jotted something down without looking up. Ava watched her pen move in tiny, efficient strokes, as if reducing the moment to a line item might make it easier to digest. "I didn't react out of anger," Ava continued, not raising her voice. "I reacted because the system we serve is built on the idea that our badges mean something. And when a fellow officer puts his hand over my mouth in a public hallway in front of a junior colleague while I'm in uniform, that badge is already compromised. I didn't break protocol. I reasserted it. The words hung in the room longer than she expected. For a moment, even the ventilation seemed to quiet. Then the woman with sharp eyes leaned in slightly. You're aware that physical retaliation is against code, regardless of provocation. Yes, Ava replied. But I'm also aware that protecting the integrity of the badge is supposed to be the code's purpose, not just its language. Silence again. One of the men shifted in his seat but said nothing. Ava looked around the room not to challenge, but to be seen. Not as a headline, not as a disruption, but as a professional who had spent 2 decades serving without blemish, without complaint, who had kept her voice even when others raised theirs, who had chosen silence for years, not because she agreed, but because she knew exactly what speaking cost. I've never struck a fellow officer, she added. Never thought I would. But that wasn't just a moment of disrespect. That was an erasure. And if I hadn't responded, that erasure would have become part of the record, unchallenged, uncorrected, normalized. The chairwoman finally looked up from her notes. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes lingered longer than before. We've also received substantial community feedback regarding this incident, she said carefully. Support for you has been significant. Ava said nothing. She didn't have to. That was the part they hadn't expected, the part that had made this hearing happen behind closed doors, instead of being quietly buried under departmental protocol. The people outside the courthouse, the letters, the emails, the veterans, the young officers, the footage that had gone viral not because of its violence, but because of its clarity. The clarity of what happened, and who chose to do something about it. Final question, the older man said, his voice slower now. Would you make the same choice again? Ava didn't blink. I would make it sooner. There were no more questions after that. The meeting adjourned without ceremony. No applause, no outrage, just a short statement that she would be informed of the outcome within 48 hours and a suggestion to remain available for follow-up. Ava stood, adjusted her coat, and walked out without a glance behind her. The hallway outside the review room was narrow, lined with blank walls and muted carpet. A junior officer passed her without speaking, but gave a small nod, tight, respectful, like a salute that didn't need protocol to be understood. And as Ava stepped out into the sharp afternoon air, the sun hit her face without hesitation, warm and full, and for the first time in a long while she let it stay there. The decision came on a Thursday afternoon, announced in a quiet internal bulletin posted to the department's intranet just after 3:00 p.m., folded between meeting minutes and a training memo about use of force de-escalation. It was written in the usual institutional tone, formal, evasive, allergic to emotion, but the message was clear beneath the language. Following a comprehensive review of conduct, Officer Rick Talley is hereby terminated from duty effective immediately. Lieutenant, Ava Durant has been cleared of all wrongdoing and reinstated without disciplinary action. No fanfare, no apology, just a line drawn finally after years of avoiding the pen. Ava found out the same way everyone else did. She was sitting alone in the precinct break room, staring into the steam of her second cup of coffee, when someone muttered from across the table, "They posted it." She didn't look up right away. She waited for the rest of the room to respond, waited to see if anyone would laugh or roll their eyes or break the silence with something cynical. But no one did. There was a pause, long and low, and then someone else said, "About damn time." She glanced at the screen then, just long enough to read the headline. Her name in bold, cleared, reinstated. It felt almost surreal, like watching someone else's justice happen from a distance without the weight of disbelief pressing against her chest. There were no phone calls, no handshake from command, just a notification, just a door closing quietly, decisively behind her. What came after, though, didn't stay quiet for long. That evening, the department inbox was flooded with messages not from journalists or officials, but from people, retired officers who hadn't worn a uniform in 20 years, civilian employees, paramedics, janitors, recruits still in academy. Some wrote only one line, "Thank you." Others told longer stories, pages of memory about the times they'd been overlooked, undermined, or silenced, each one now believing just a little more that silence didn't have to be the rule. She read them slowly, one by one, not rushing through them like updates, but honoring each as a window into someone else's battle. One message stayed with her more than the rest, a short note from a white sergeant who'd served with Tally years ago. He wrote, "I stood by when I should have spoken up. That won't happen again. You reminded me who we serve." The next morning, a printed version of that bulletin was taped to the courthouse front doors. Below it, someone had written in thick black marker, "Justice isn't always polite. Sometimes it slaps back." That same day, the local paper ran a headline in clean serif font, "Lieutenant Durant reinstated after viral incident, public outcry credited." But Ava didn't read the article. She didn't need their framing. She had lived the real story, every second of silence, every glance turned sideways, every time she had to choose between her dignity and her job. Now finally, for once, they didn't get to rewrite it. At the department headquarters, things began to shift, not overnight but perceptibly. Officers who had once avoided her in the hall now nodded with something that felt close to respect. Younger women on the force stopped by her office to talk not just about policy but about endurance. One of them, barely 2 years in, asked her quietly, "How do you stay calm when they want to tear you down?" Ava took a breath and answered without hesitation. "You don't stay calm," she said. "You stay grounded. There's a difference." Word spread fast that Tally had cleaned out his locker without a word. Eyes down, no ceremony. No one stopped him. No one clapped. Some were relieved, others unsure. But all of them saw what the system had tried so long to avoid: accountability, not as a scandal, but as a start. Later that week, the police chief made a brief appearance at roll call. He didn't mention Ava's name, didn't mention the slap, just said, "We're entering a season of reflection. Let's lead with integrity." It was vague enough to forget, but pointed enough to remember. And as Ava stood in the back of the room, arms crossed loosely, eyes steady, she realized something had changed, not just in policy, but in posture. People were listening differently now, and outside, the protests had softened into something quieter, more enduring. A mural was painted on the side of a brick wall near the courthouse. Ava's silhouette in blues and golds, head held high, not in glory, but in clarity. Beneath it were the words, "She didn't raise her voice, she raised the standard." Ava didn't pose for it. She didn't authorize it. But when she walked by one morning on her way to work, she paused just long enough to take it in. Not for ego, not for credit, but because she finally saw herself reflected in something the city had built instead of something it had buried. And in that still moment, in the quiet between footfalls and sunrise, she let herself feel the one thing she had never dared to claim before: victory. Earned, not given. The marble hallway looked the same as it always had: polished floors, reflecting the soft afternoon light, the air still carrying the faint scent of floor wax and worn leather. But to Ava Durant, walking through it now felt entirely different. The silence, once oppressive, no longer pressed down on her shoulders like a warning. It had changed subtly but undeniably into something else, an acknowledgement, a kind of quiet respect that didn't demand attention but offered space. She walked slowly, not because she was uncertain, but because she wanted to feel every step of the return. Her shoes clicked steadily across the floor, the same rhythm she'd walked for years. But this time, the sound carried further, almost like the building itself had decided to listen. The portraits on the walls didn't look any less solemn, and the ceiling lights still buzzed faintly overhead, but somehow the space had softened. No longer a place she had to brace herself to enter. Now it was hers, too. A few people passed her in the hall, officers, clerks, one judge in chambers, robes, and each offered a nod or a quiet lieutenant as she passed. Not performative, not forced, just real. One young officer she didn't know gave her a small smile and stepped aside without breaking stride. She returned it without thinking, her body adjusting to the new equilibrium without hesitation. These weren't gestures of apology, they were gestures of recognition. And that more than anything else told her something had shifted for good. When she reached the South Annex, she paused just outside the double doors. For a moment, she simply stood there, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the doorway, her eyes tracing the stretch of corridor where it had all unfolded. It looked exactly the same, the vending machines humming softly, the bulletin board with uneven flyers, the benches aligned neatly along the wall. But the energy was different now. The silence no longer held a threat. It held memory. She stepped forward slowly, letting the moment settle. Her fingers brushed the wall as she passed it, not out of sentimentality, but as a kind of grounding. like touching a scar that no longer ached, only reminded. Her breath stayed steady. Her hands stayed relaxed. There was nothing left to defend here, only something to reclaim. A junior officer, Dean, stood at the end of the corridor, clipboard in hand, checking equipment tags near the exit. When he saw her, he straightened instinctively, then caught himself and smiled instead. "Good afternoon, Lieutenant," he said, his voice more confident than the last time she'd seen him. "Afternoon, Officer Dean," she replied, pausing beside him. "Everything running smooth?" He nodded, then hesitated just a moment before speaking again. "People still talk about it, you know," he said, eyes flicking toward the hallway behind them. "What happened here?" Ava looked past him for a second, then met his gaze. "Let them talk," she said, quiet and calm. "Let them remember." He gave a thoughtful nod, as if hearing something deeper in her voice than just the words. Then he turned back to his clipboard, and she walked on. The walk back toward her office was unhurried, filled with glances she no longer had to interpret, and spaces she no longer had to shrink into. She passed through the reception area, where someone had placed a framed quote on the wall. Nothing dramatic, just 4 words etched into glass. "Dignity doesn't ask permission." She didn't know who had hung it, and she didn't need to. When she reached her office, she opened the door and stepped inside without pausing. The desk was clean, the chair still exactly where she'd left it, her nameplate untouched on the corner. She sat down and let the weight of the seat settle beneath her, not heavy but grounding. She opened a file folder, then paused, staring for a moment at the blank form inside. Out the window, the sun was beginning to shift lower in the sky, casting long lines across the precinct parking lot. The shadows reached up the walls like questions waiting for answers. A knock on the door brought her back. "Got a minute?" It was Captain Lin, one of the few who had stayed silent during the investigation but never looked away. Ava nodded once. "Yeah, come in." He closed the door behind him, then remained standing for a moment, hat in hand, expression thoughtful. "I just wanted to say, not everything moves fast around here. But some things do move, thanks to you." She met his eyes. "Took more than just me." He gave a soft chuckle. "Maybe. But it started with you." Then he paused. "You thinking about putting in for deputy chief next cycle?" Ava raised an eyebrow, amused. "One fight at a time, Captain." He grinned, then nodded and turned to leave. "Fair enough." As the door clicked softly shut behind him, Ava leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes for a moment. Not to escape, not to rest, just to breathe. And in that breath she let herself feel the full weight of everything that had come before, the pressure, the silence, the choice, the slap, the waiting, the cost, and knew that none of it had been wasted, because the point had never been the noise. It had always been the echo, and now for once the echo belonged to her. What happened in that courthouse hallway wasn't just a confrontation, it was a revelation. Lieutenant Ava Durant didn't raise her voice. She didn't seek attention. She stood her ground when dignity was pushed too far, and in doing so, she reminded all of us that silence is not always peace, and patience is not always safety. For years she played by the rules, hoping the system would protect those who served it with honor. But when the moment came, she made a choice not just for herself, but for every unseen voice, every bowed head, every good person who stayed quiet because they feared losing everything. This story is about more than a slap. It's about the weight of restraint, the cost of speaking up, and the quiet courage it takes to protect not just a uniform, but the soul that wears it. It's a call to remember that justice doesn't always arrive with applause. Sometimes it walks silently through marble hallways, steady, unshaken, and absolutely unafraid. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you know or something you've lived through, don't let it end here. Like it, share it, and subscribe for more stories that shine a light on truth, courage, and the quiet power of standing tall when the world expects you to bow. Because the greatest change doesn't always come from shouting. Sometimes it comes from one person refusing to stay silent. And that, my friends, is how dignity wins.